to be modest, okay? But some of which are on the table back here, so if you haven't gotten a chance to check out the table, please, okay? Because we have someone in the front row here, please. Yes, ma'am, hold it up, yes. All right. All of these books that you've written, I mean, it's phenomenal. We have On This Day in Memphis History, A Brief History of Memphis, Hidden History of Memphis, Mayor Crump Don't Like It, Machine Politics in Memphis. That's a good title. Crusades for Freedom, Transformation of the American South, Enslavement in Memphis, and Thoughts on Memphis, Scouting in Memphis. And those are just to name the ones that we can find. Tell me about your journey as an author and why Memphis is so important to you to write about.
Well, writing is always something that I wanted to do. It's just, I think, when I was a little boy, I can remember copying a book and putting it together and giving it to my mom and saying, hey, I wrote a book. And so that was just something, I guess, it was in me when I was born, fascinated with words, that sort of thing. And, but when I was 5, the city celebrated its 150th anniversary, called the Sesquicentennial. I couldn't pronounce that at age 5 by any means, but there were all these celebrations going on in the city, partly because of what happened the year before in 1968 when Dr. King was murdered here, and our failure to provide justice to the sanitation workers. And so the city, I guess, needed something to feel good about. And so, unlike other celebrations, which have some success and so on, this one was different. It was everywhere. So much so that a 5-year-old noticed it was going on. And during that summer, both the Commercial Appeal and the afternoon newspaper, the Memphis Press-Semeter, did this 150-page book that came with the paper that was a history of the city, all these essays about it, all these photographs. I mean, I couldn't quite read at 5, but I was still fascinated by it because there would be images of the city that I recognized. And so, well, I've seen that before. And as I got older, my parents would keep it with the old Funk and Wagnalls encyclopedias that we used to have. And so every once in a while, I'd pull it down and read it, and just was really fascinated by the history of this town. And I felt a connection to it because I'm from here. It's my city. And so that really is where I got started in thinking about that. Went off to school, all that, and then had an opportunity to come to work at the library, and came to the history department. And every day we have customers coming in who are asking questions about the history of the city. And I was learning as they were learning, because I pulled material from the clipping files or a manuscript collection or a book. And I was learning too, and I was discovering all of these things I had no idea that had happened in Memphis, whether it be so many things. I'm not going to go into that unless somebody has a question about it, but because I'll be here all day. So just finding these stories, and so as time went on, I started collecting those stories myself. If there was a clipping file about something that was unique or interesting, I'd make a copy of it, put it in a file, and sort of say, I'm going to do something with this someday. And so then we received the papers of E.H. Crump. And at that time, I was very fascinated with that period and sort of how the city worked politically. And that led to the first book. And then from there, I just started writing other books, because my goal really in some ways, what I'm doing is writing one big book, looking at the city from different angles, from different perspectives, and while at the same time having people from other books show up again in a second one, a kind of shared universe kind of thing. And so when I'm done, you'll have my version of what I think the city is important, and it's extremely important and unique in so many ways.
Absolutely. And that I feel like is very important. I just realized when I looked into all of this, how many things happened that year, in the year that Cossitt was founded.
That's right.
And so this is not a 1-year project. This is not a 10-year project. This is an extensive project from multiple community partners that had to come together and really work together to make Cossitt happen. So tell me, who was Mr. Cossitt?
Frederick Cossitt was a businessman from Ohio when Memphis was occupied by Union forces in the summer of 1862. There was a lot of what we might call passive resistance from the pro-Confederate white population of the city. In one way is that they refused to cooperate with Union forces. They wouldn't open their shops. They simply closed them. So with no commerce going on, and of course soldiers are given, particularly then, the bare necessities of life. So if you wanted to get a drink of liquor, you wanted to get chewing tobacco, you wanted to supplement your diet, whatever, there's no place to go. So the Union commander at the time, General William Sherman, he had connections to the state of Ohio. And so working with the government of Ohio, they gathered some boats together and had several businessmen come to town through the river in order to reopen shops. Cossitt was one of those. He owned a dry goods store, which is sort of the general store. Everybody's seen a Western, everybody's seen them go in. It's very similar to that. And then he started investing in cotton and made a fortune in cotton. And so he eventually left Memphis, but before he left, he had told various civic leaders that he really wanted to do something with the city. So he made him. I mean, he was just a middling, a store owner. But he comes here and then becomes a rich, rich man. And in other letters, so once he got back home, he'd write other letters and say, yeah, I really need to do something with Memphis. And at one point he said, maybe a library. But then he died without ever actually making that a reality. So one of the men who he had corresponded with a lot, a man named Carrington Mason, gathered together some of the civic leaders, the mayor, and various business people, political people, and said, we should really go to his family and see if they wouldn't be willing to donate. This is what he wanted, and we really need a library. And in the state of Tennessee, there was not a real public library anywhere in the state. Of course, Knoxville had UT. This is several years before the normal school, which became the University of Memphis, had opened. There were a few what were called subscription libraries, where you paid a fee every year in order to have access to them. And Memphis really in 1893, or in the 1890s, the city was recovering from the 1878 yellow fever epidemic, and was just getting out from under the taxing district phase, where the state of Tennessee pulled our city charter, and we became a taxing district of the state. And the state essentially is very similar, I guess, to when they take over schools, very similar to that. They took over local government, and there were some positions were elected, others were appointed by the governor, and the city could not incur debt. They had to get permission from the state in order to purchase anything, and to do capital improvements and all those kinds of things. So while that is going on, this effort to build a public library is also gaining traction. They contact his daughters. One of them was married was a Juilliard, her husband was the founder of the Juilliard School of Music in New York. And they readily agreed. There was no negotiation. They thought it was a great idea. They liked honoring their father, of course. So they donated $75,000, which was a lot of money at that time. An agreement was worked out with the city government that they would give property to the Cossitt Library and would agree to pay operating funds for the library once it was established, but that they would not pay for the building, the construction of the actual library. So a library board was appointed, and a library director was appointed, and they began building. And they built this beautiful, we had a picture of it earlier, of this beautiful red sandstone, Romanesque style building, which was absolutely beautiful and looked nothing like anything else downtown. It was just classic, you know, it just looked beautiful. And it looked like something important, even if you didn't know it was a library. It was so beautiful, in fact, that they spent the entire $75,000 on the building and then had no money for books. So the day it opened in 1893, it was a beautiful building, but it had no information in it. So they went back to the Cossitt family and they donated another $75,000. And they also were approached by a man named Philip Boland, who had an extremely large book collection, who donated his book collection to the library. So it wasn't long before the library was up and running.
And that's what I mean by that idea of community,
That's
right? Where it took so many people. I mean, just in my exploring this story, I was so surprised at the names Carrington Mason, Napoleon Hill, D.P. Haddon. I was very surprised to hear about D.P. Haddon's, carrying on in business affairs in downtown Memphis and his sanitation checks, as people would say, on his horse and buggy.
Right.
But these were important men who came together and said, we really need to do something. And they agreed to do it in the absence of their friend, because at that point he had passed away.
That's right.
And so when you think about two women now getting together in a time like that,
Yes.
and saying, we're going to also put our money in the hat.
That's right.
For a political conversation to be
That's
had. The Juilliard School of Music was an interesting point for me, because I was like, wait, she was a Juilliard?
Yeah.
The original Juilliard?
Right.
The
Right.
Juilliard?
Yes.
I mean, I was blown away by that story, and blown away even more that, and it was also a novel fact, that her husband allowed her to do that.
That's correct.
Because that is an allowance in those days.
Absolutely. She had no control over her own money. And you're absolutely right that it was a brave thing for her to do, to say, yeah, her and her other siblings to do that. And then to come back for additional money, and there was no squawking about that. Okay, that makes sense. And they gave another $75,000. So no, and what you're going to see with the history of Cossitt and the public library system in general is it's going to be established for white people. Okay, this is the beginnings of segregation. It is interesting that we have the ledger book for the day Cossitt opened, and the name Julia Hooks appears. So she came through the building. She was an African American. She's sort of the matriarch of the Hooks family, very important to the city in many ways, an educator and civil rights activist. And she was there on that day. So at least on that day, and that's during a time when things are still very flexible about segregation, but it doesn't take long for them to say blacks cannot use the library. And there was another form of segregation that was going on within the library, and that is there were two separate reading rooms, one for men and one for women. The very idea that men and women would sit together, sit close by, reading books is, I suppose, dangerous in some way. And so in the first few years, circulation increased. So and then you're going to see sort of the next phase of when the Memphis Public Library and Cossitt Library in particular becomes a true public library, is as a result of the sit-in demonstration in the early 60s, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
No, that's okay. And I do want to mention, so going back to just so I can set the stage for everyone about where we are in American history, I think it's really important for us to know what all was happening that year. So 1893 was a very interesting year. So in May, if you did not know, that very year, the Supreme Court ruled that the tomato is a vegetable for import purposes. So that was a big deal, that the tomato is now becoming a vegetable. So then that June, and now this is something else that I didn't know, Gandhi's first act of civil disobedience was that June, the very first act. And so when you think about Gandhi's life and the legacy that he left, I mean, that's incredible. July, Daniel Hale Williams, a black man from Pennsylvania, performs the first open heart surgery that's ever been successfully done. I was blown away by that. And then with no penicillin or blood transfusion, may I add. And then October, we have the Chicago World Fair. And so by that December, it feels like humanity is on top, where Ford completes the first gas engine and Canada introduces the first electric car. I was just blown away with humanity and where we were. And I will also say, back to your point about, segregated versus desegregated libraries, this is happening in 1893, but the first Black library would be in 1905. So that's not that far from the original inception of the library to then introduce a quote-unquote colored library, and that was a huge deal. So when you think about 1905, we're still in Jim Crow South. So tell me about the first, because it was at Lemoyne-Owen.
That's right.
And that was interesting to me, to hear that it was at a college and not its own standing building.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of reasons why it was at Lemoyne. One was the obvious one that the building already existed. They didn't want to spend as much money on a black library. But so there's already a place. The college already has a library, or the institute, I think it's still in the 1905, but has their own library, which had already been serving that South Memphis community. But it's also that Lemoyne is an extremely respected educational institution in Memphis, back then as well as now. So it made sense for them to partner with Lemoyne because it was such a fine educational institution already. But of course it also gave the library board and Cossitt Library Incorporated a cheap way to do it, right? And most of the first books that were public library books were discards from Cossitt. They didn't buy very many new books. A few, but not many. And they certainly were not tailored to the community. That is to say, there's a lot of African American history that's being written at that time. None of that is going on. They don't purchase those. I don't think, the staff at Lemoyne were Lemoyne College staff, not public library staff. So the library was not hiring the African Americans to be librarians, not yet. And so that's what's happening there. Is but at least there was public library service. It was certainly not equal. In many ways, it was discriminatory. But for the individual, who's trying to learn something, or trying to improve his or her life, or hungry for community, whatever it is they need, at least they have that, which was better than nothing, although that's often an excuse to keep people down. But yeah.
Absolutely. And I when I read deeper into the men who did come together, I found there to be some swaying views there,
Yes.
a matter of opinion about, what we should do as a community and all these other things. The year before Cossitt was founded and opened, that is when the 3 black men were lynched for
Right.
the People's Grocery.
That's right.
And Ida B. Wells goes on to write, and tell people to leave Memphis
Right.
and to continue to encourage people of color to find their own independent and forge their own way. But when we look at Lemoyne Owen, that was an interesting time for me. And so that history kind of continues, because before we even get into the 50s and on, as we know to be modern history is the 50s and on, Rosenwald happens. And so if you all aren't familiar, there is a such thing as Rosenwald schools. They were all over America, and the founder of his name is Rosenwald.
Yeah, Julius Rosenwald.
Yes, tell us a little bit about him and what that looked like.
Yeah, Rosenwald was a very successful white businessman, one of the owners of Sears and Roebuck. I forget which one of the founders, Sears or Roebuck, one of them, was not interested in really running the business. He didn't want to be a well-known businessman. He just wanted a job, and he wanted, of course, to live in comfort. And so he essentially sold out his section, of the store, and Rosenwald bought it, and whichever one it was had a job for life, and of course he had the money that he made from selling his portion of the business. But Rosenwald he probably is really the reason. He's probably the one that's behind the great success of Sears and Roebuck. But he's a white man from the North, but has a strong sense of obligation to African Americans. Not sure where that comes from, but he very much had it. And so he established a fund called the Rosenwald Fund that was to build schools specifically for African Americans in impoverished areas, and particularly in the South. Now, they were all over the country, but there was, of course, a particular interest in providing schools for Black Americans. But the Rosenwald Fund would also provide funding for other things if it was tailored to serve the African American community. So in 1931, Cossitt applied for and received a grant from the Rosenwald Fund to have bookmobile service in the rural, particularly in the rural areas, but also in the poorer areas of Memphis that couldn't get to Cossitt very easily, or to Lemoyne. The first bookmobile service was specifically designed to reach out to Black people and provide service to them. So for the individuals who were able to take advantage of that, that's an important service to have, and the knowledge that was passed on.
Absolutely. And when we look at like New Cossitt, New Cossitt doesn't come until 58.
That's right.
So there's these, between the years of 1905 and 1958, so many things happen in between there that doesn't get, discussed.
Right.
And in the meantime, Mr. Cossitt's money, it's working.
That's right.
There's over 2 million books that are being circulated.
That's right.
And the women's room becomes a children's area.
That's right. In 1905, Memphis hired its first professional librarian in 1901, a man named Charles Dutton Johnson. He was a very progressive, not necessarily the way we just use progressive now, but was someone who was forward-thinking, and actually he expanded services at Lemoyne. He bought more books, and it wasn't just discards. So they had a line item in the budget for Lemoyne and started purchasing better, more materials, newer materials, better works. But public libraries were not built for children. No one thought of children as needing a public library. The idea behind a public library was really for it to be the people's university, where people can come in and better themselves, particularly sort of the working class, so that they would. So they offered lectures, classes, all of the things that libraries do now. We were doing then as a way to further higher education, at least in a less formal. You wouldn't get a degree out of it, but you would get the knowledge. And which is why the reading rooms were always very quiet, and all that kind of stuff that is associated now stereotypes. Libraries are nothing like that now. But so Johnston realized that, and it was a growing sense within the library community nationally, that there should be some kind of children's services. These are potential users of the library in the future. But not only that, children need access to books. They need access to the concept of literacy, that books are not just something that you're forced to deal with in school, but actually something that you can enjoy and improve yourself. So in 1905, they closed the women's reading room and made the men's reading room an open reading room for men and women, and opened the children's department. We were one of the first in the country and only the second in the South. And I think there were like 5 or 6 in the whole country. So that really sets the stage for the Memphis library system to become really an innovative system, always looking for new opportunities to provide service. And that fortunately continues to this day.
And I noticed in the history that there were a lot of mention about series, going out of their way to buy different series of books.
That's right.
And they have a lot of pictures of all these children gathered around the desk, ready to check out their books and things.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the history and how it kind of like transforms between the 30s and the 40s, because something happens before the 50s that tell us a little bit.
Yeah, there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're looking at the history of Memphis, and one of the most important really is that African Americans in Memphis voted in large numbers. You had 20,000 of a population of about 60,000 who were African Americans who were registered to vote. And they have strong influence on the direction of city government. It's not equal. There's no utopia here. But they have a seat at the table. It's at the end of the table, right? But it's still at the table, where in so many other communities, they're not there at all. They're not even at the kiddies' table, And so they had a voice, and they had influence. And because of that, as we've seen with opening Lemoyne in the first place, and with the Rosenwald Fund, it's not just, nice white people who are going to give something to blacks. It was the African American community pushing for these things and demanding these things. And one of the things that was very important to the African American community is Lemoyne was too isolated for so many people who couldn't. It was hard to get there. And yeah, you got the bus system, you got the trolley and all of that, but still, it was in one neighborhood, but it wasn't centrally located to reach out to a larger African American community. And so there was a strong push to build a standalone library for African Americans. And that came to pass in 1939 when the Vance Avenue branch, when it was actually an old funeral home that they purchased, but it was a great building. I mean, it was large, it was, it had plenty of room, and most importantly, they hired African Americans as librarians when it was opened in '39. So you had Geneva Cooper and other libraries. Geneva Cooper was the first, and who transformed that library into a hub of black community, black culture, as well as community in Memphis, because they went even farther than what Cossitt was doing in terms of they offered reading and writing classes, they offered help in finding jobs. It became a major focus of the community, because kids are going there every day after school, and on the weekends too, and attending story times, and of course everything is geared towards the black community, and it becomes a beloved institution because of that. Still segregated, but so important. And like Lemoyne, it really helped build the black middle class in Memphis. So many people learned so many things and were told, you don't have to be stopped by the color of your skin. If you want to be an accountant, you want to be a banker, you want to be a businessman, you can do that. You're not getting that. Well, you are getting it in the school system because it's a segregated system. You're not getting it in the white community, but so that is in the 30s and the 40s with the Rosenwald bookmobiles, the opening of Vance, and the continuing success of Lemoyne. As I say, is building this black middle class who in the 1950s are sick and tired of segregation. And the fight against segregation goes back to the 1890s. I mean, there are many cases of Memphians, black Memphians, standing up against segregation and so on. But the foundation for what we see in the 1960s and 1970s in many ways is laid by Vance and the public library system.
Absolutely. And thank you for touching on that, because I also found it interesting to see there was a library at Foot Homes as well. And so I instantly, instead of thinking of Cossitt as a standalone library, I started to think of it as a seed.
That's right.
I said, oh, this is where it started.
Right.
There was no Memphis public library system. There was no, come and get a free book. And then when I looked up the other historical information, I said, free library for all. I said, wasn't it always free?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
Not for all.
Not for all. Absolutely, absolutely. So tell me about New Cossitt, because what we're sitting in right now was a really big deal.
That's right.
This was a big deal.
That's right.
They were like, we're about to do this. This new architecture, it's shiny. They described it in the newspaper, which at the time we had the Appeal and we had the Memphis.
The Press-Senator was the afternoon paper.
There we go. We had two different papers reporting about a new aluminum building that was on the aluminum, which I thought was like such a choice of words. I was like, aluminum. I was like, well, I guess it kind of is if you're comparing it to this older red brick. But tell me about the new Cossitt and what that looked like.
Well, it's pretty clear after World War II that Memphis needed to increase its public library service. In fact, there was a need to improve the infrastructure in general. I mean, there had been a lot of neglect because of the Great Depression, and the war comes. It's not anything that anybody wanted to do, but it was necessary given the economy and the state of the world. But after the war, the library board went to city government and said, listen, we've got, this is shameful. We need a better library system. Not just Cossitt, not just Vance, but we need to expand beyond. But for Cossitt, It needed improvements, it needed more room, it needed to be more efficient in how it was organized, because when it was built, there was a lot of infrastructure within the building that was designed to capture natural light. There used to be, well, I think they're still there. In the back, there's some of the stacks area that has glass floors, and that was to capture natural light that would come in through the windows and come up through the floor. But buildings weren't being built like that in the 1950s, and so it was decided that Cossitt needed to be improved. The question was, do you keep the red sandstone structure? Do you renovate, or do you tear it down? You can see in the parking lot the remnants of the red sandstone, which is the 1925 edition, which is now 100 years old. And put your hand on it, it's crumbling. I mean, it's just the nature of the type of material. So it may have been that tearing it down, the original 1893 structure made sense, but instead of rebuilding the castle, which, think of how that would look today, how beautiful that would be, they decided to create this mid-century modern, very 1950s, space age kind of look, which I think we could say is regrettable. Nicely, we could say regrettable. Actually, it's awful. I mean, you know, it is. It just is. And it looks far more dated than, and I'm not blaming the renovation, mind you. I mean, you know, keeping it is perfectly acceptable.
It's okay, I'll call the architect.
Yeah, right. Hey, I said it. Yeah. But you know, I mean, I think the argument could have been made that they could have recreated it in different material and still made it that structure, which was so good. But anyway, it's beside the point. But it did expand Cossitt and made it more modern, made it more efficient. So the improvements were very, very good. In fact, this stairwell here, that didn't exist. You came up in the back where the old second reading room was, which overlooked the river and had a beautiful view of the river, and that's where all the historical material was. And so, I mean, it was all in all, it was better than leaving it alone, to be sure. But when it opens in 1958, and it is still segregated. And Cossitt is becoming, at that time, more of a reference library. Main Library had been opened at Peabody and McLean 5 years or 3 years before, 1955, and it became the main circulating library. So you would go there to check out books. Of course, you would do other things as well, but as my mom said, she can remember taking the bus from South Memphis and going to Maine to do a school project. There were fewer people because the population of Memphis was changing to the downtown area. And so they repositioned Cossitt as more of a reference business technical library, which means that you couldn't check the books out, you used them. Well, one day in 1958, a man named Jesse Turner, who was a World War II veteran, graduate of Lemoyne, worked for Tri-State Bank, walked into Maine and wanted a library card. He wanted to check out what was there. Particularly, it was a request of his wife's, I need this book. I need you to go to the library to get it. She really didn't mean try to get a library card, but because you could go to Vans and request any circulating book that you wanted, and it'd be sent to Vans. You just couldn't pick it up at Cossitt or at Maine. Well, instead, he asked for a library card because they denied it. And he eventually sued, he and the NAACP, which begins the desegregation. And I'm not sure if it's important to talk about that.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I know that everyone took the tour. So when you saw the beautiful mural downstairs, and we talk about the legacy of Benjamin L. Hooks and what that really means to really stand up to something, but to stand up to something in a very, very scary time. It's a very, very scary time to do such a thing. Tell us a little bit about, because now we're also, instead of Cossitt being the main library, right, we have another main library. They're debating on building another. At this point, I think there's 6 libraries now.
That's right.
And so tell me a little bit about that period.
Certainly. So the renovation of Cossitt, the opening of Maine, then the opening of the Highland Branch Library, which wasn't the first, Vance was the first, but it was the first post-war branch. And Cossitt had always had branches in storefronts and in neighborhood sort of things, and there had been African Americans ones as well, but they were not standalone branches, and it was really just for people to pop in, grab a book, and go home. It really wasn't meant to be wasn't a full service library branch system. But Memphis was growing. Memphis was moving eastward. And so that's part of the thinking of starting to build branches in the neighborhoods where people live. And much of that is because of how the Black community embraced Vance, because they saw just how important a branch library is for a neighborhood and a broader community. And at the same time, of course, there is growing dissatisfaction with the status quo and segregation. Young people who had grown into the middle class, their parents worked who graduated from Lemoyne, learned many skills at Vance Library. After the war, there was, more African American doctors and lawyers and engineers and architects and all of that, and business people. So the young people are not satisfied with the traditional roots of protest. In Memphis, of course, we talked about how important black voting was. So the political realm was one way to attack segregation, and it had been done for decades, or at least to try to make it better. The second phase was second line of attack was legal, as Jesse Turner is doing, suing the library system. But for young people, this is taking way too long. And in February of 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, a group of students sit in at a lunch counter. And so the students at Lemoyne, SAO and junior college, which they'll be combined in 1968, they're excited about this. We can do this. And so they start out going after lunch counters, because that's what the Greensboro kids have done. But they realize within a day or so that the real fight is in public institutions they can't use, and that they are paying for with their taxes. And so they immediately begin to sit in at Cossitt. They go to Maine eventually. They go to the zoo. They go to Brooks Art Museum. But it's the library that becomes the focal point of protest. And of course, they're immediately arrested. And white Memphis is shocked at this. Can't believe this is happening here. And we always thought they were so happy.
Yeah, We gave them 3 libraries.
Yeah, exactly.
With
I mean,
discarded
what do you want?
books. Are you not-
Exactly. So, all of them were arrested. I think it was 32 on the first day. And they decided to try to throw the book at them by charging them not just with disorderly conduct, but with what is called breach of the peace, which is actually a felony. You can go to prison for that. Disorderly conduct is, a small misdemeanor, small fine, you go about your business. But breach of peace is serious. All of the African American attorneys in Memphis, organized or collected by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, rallied to their cause. Benjamin Hooks, Ben Jones, Russell Sugarman, A.W. Willis, J.L. Estes, I may be leaving somebody out. They're all, as you mentioned, in the mural, because that comes from a photograph that was taken by Ernest Withers, and the judge allowed him to take photographs in the court, which normally there are no photographs in, because he had been a police officer, and the judge knew it. And he asked me, Judge, would it be all right? He said, yeah, come on. And he actually let him stand behind the judge's bench to get a good picture, which he did. He got several good pictures.
Hey, Ernest Withers is a bad man.
Yeah.
That's a bad man with a camera.
That's right.
If you ain't never seen the Ernest Withers, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I
Yeah.
just had to mention that.
Please
That's
do.
a bad man with a camera.
Oh yeah, his photograph is absolutely brilliant, and of course he's capturing scenes that nobody would, and he was fearless when it came to taking photographs. I mean, he had gone just a few years before, gone down to why am I blanking? Or Emmett Till, he had gone down and taken photographs of the body with the permission of the family. And yes, sir, did you have a question? So yeah, he was a fearless guy, and he did everything he could to document as much as he could. The judge threw out the peace charge and found them guilty of disorderly conduct. There's no jail time for disorderly conduct. Normally, it's a small fine, which the NAACP paid. But they still had a record, and I've talked to a few of them. In fact, I talked to Gwen Glover, who was one of the original sit-in demonstrators, and she was telling me that for years, for over a decade, she could not get a job with the city to be a teacher or to be anything else because she had that charge. And now, eventually, they've been expunged, thankfully, but way too late. No, they paid a huge price for their bravery. And, the sit-in demonstrations actually expand, become more common both at the lunch counters and so on. But remember, when I talked about African Americans having political clout, there had been a tradition of blacks and whites sitting together, the white power structure of the black community sitting down, hashing out a compromise. It was always, it was always very, very unequal, right? But the lines of communication were open here in a way that they weren't in other places. So, the NAACP took leadership of the sit-in demonstration. They didn't stop anybody from demonstrating or anything. They just simply took over mainly the negotiation, which some of the younger people didn't really like. Older people get involved. But they were right to do so because they had this communication. So it took over a year and before there was any real movement. And but even before that, at the end of 1960, the library board and the city commission agreed to desegregate all public libraries. First victory in the sit-in demonstrations and in what we think of as the modern civil rights in Memphis.
What year?
1960, December of 1960. So they started in March, and the agreement was reached in December. The lawsuit is still going on, mind you, but it was very much delayed. But when they desegregated, this is so stupid, but here at Cossitt and at Maine, they said we will desegregate everything but the restroom. And so their idea was that black customer would have to go to the janitorial restroom in the basement. And the one at Peabody in McLean, I used myself when I worked there before it was closed, before we moved to Poplar. It is a tiny, narrow little thing. It really wasn't a good place. But I liked it because I could get away from the main floor for a minute, you know, but yeah, it was awful. So, but this had to be agreed upon by the federal judge because the lawsuit's still in effect. The NAACP said, we're not dropping the suit just because the board is desegregated. So they go to the judge, and the judge says, that ain't gonna work. That's unconstitutional. And so that was in early 61, that removed the final barrier and the final indignity of using the library system. So at that point, Cossitt and the Memphis Public Library system becomes a true public library, open to everybody, regardless of who they are or regardless of what they need. We don't make any judgments about what somebody needs. And so we really didn't have a fully functioning public library until the end of 1960.
And I think that is just so interesting when you put it into perspective of when Martin Luther King gets assassinated compared to when that happens. I mean, we are living history. We are living in history right now. Right. We were living in it then. Right. And it's just so baffling to me how close together these years, they're so succinct. I mean, it literally happened. Boom, 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 boom. Yes. And so what was the effect that the library, what effect did Martin Luther King's assassination have on Memphis Public Libraries or Cossitt more specifically?
Mm-hmm. Well, what happens is the public library is shocked and dismayed by not just what was happening with Dr. King's murder, but also the whole strike in general. And the library director at the time, Lamar Wallace, and the library board and staff were clamoring, we've got to do more. The library can actually make things better in terms of reaching out to the African American community, providing more services, providing more opportunities. One of the first things that they do after Dr. King is killed is they compile a pamphlet that includes a bibliography on books about the African American experience. So that not just African Americans will have access to this, but to blacks, to whites as well. And there was a renewed effort to reach out to the black community and try to get them to use all the public libraries. There was very much a social conscience at that time in library leadership because you know, the aftermath, of course, there is a great deal of hatred, resentment, distrust, and the library system made a conscious effort to try and overcome that. I'm not sure how successful they were, I'm not sure how, because the divide was so great, but over time, may not have had impact in the year or two after Dr. King's murder, but over time, it instilled this culture in the public library system, in Cossitt, to treat everyone equally and to try to go out of one's way to do programming for communities that you may not think are a part of the broader community, that because of blind spot, because of racism, whatever it is, we'll let Vance do all of that. Well, that wasn't going to work. It really should have never worked, but it certainly wasn't going to work in 1968 and 1969. So they started doing programs on Black history, not just at Vance, but at Cossitt and at Maine. And again, worked very, very assiduously to try to bring Blacks. They hired more African Americans. It was before '68 actually that there were African American librarians who were hired to work here at Cossitt. And yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't know if this question and answer. I was wondering about that though. Was there an opening for Black librarianship in
Yes.
library schools locally as desegregation was happening to?
Yeah, well, that's a good question about library schools, because we've never really had a library school here to speak of, and but there were library programs before the creation of a library degree, which didn't come along
There was a pipeline
until
to intentionally facilitate.
That's right. Because
places.
places like Enoch Pratt Library and others had a library program that was essentially a certificate program that we would think of, and that's where Geneva Cooper, who I mentioned, she went to. I think it was maybe Oberlin or somewhere. She got a library credential, and there were other African Americans who did the same. Yes, started hiring African Americans to work the public service desk, starting to provide reference services. I know there was, I worked with, in the history department, a woman who was here at Cossitt in the early '60s. And so this was after the desegregation and after the negotiations they had. Because one of the negotiations for the sit-in, one of the points of one of the demands was to open up employment in downtown restaurants and lunch counters and the library. So they began to move some from Vance, giving them an opportunity to work somewhere else, work at Cossitt. And she said that when the first African American was coming here, that this would have been probably in either '62 or '63. She said, we were told there will be no fuss about this. She is a library employee, and treat her the same as everybody else, and the customers are going to treat her like everybody else, or they're going to go. So there was very much a conscious effort to reach out, and what you'll see by the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s is there's this whole generation of African American teachers who moved over and went to work for the public library system. I've been in the system since 1994, and so I got to know a lot of them and worked with many of them who had come, who thought they were going to be teachers for the rest of their lives, but there was this opportunity, and they were actively recruiting trained individuals, African Americans, to come to work for the library system. So there was very much a conscious effort to improve employment opportunities. And yes.
So take us from the 70s into the 80s, because another huge shift happens we keep seeing Cossitt continue to grow, and of course now the Memphis Public Library system is a system, again, as I described it before, it's a seed, and so now we have, I think, 12 different libraries at this time, and I might be a little bit ahead
I think
in
it's
the count,
17 now.
Okay.
I think it's 17,
Okay.
because I think it's that, I think it's 17.
all from Cossitt. That's just so crazy.
Yeah, it is, and what happens, well, a couple things happen. Increased employment opportunities for African Americans to work in libraries, increased patron use from the Black community definitely happens. But for Cossitt in the 1970s, the fate of Cossitt is very much tied, of course, to downtown. And in the 1970s, downtown was declining in terms of people coming to downtown. Of course, some people lived near downtown, and of course, a lot of people worked downtown. But at 5 o'clock, this downtown was depopulated. I can remember in the 80s in high school, coming downtown, and it was a ghost town at night. There was nobody there. Nothing was open, or almost nothing was open. The spaghetti warehouse was open, that was there, and a couple of, and the Rendezvous, and a couple of, but for the most part, and Rayford's would have been open at that time, as it is now, but not a lot of activity downtown. So Cossitt finds itself with the prospect of declining usage. But the library doesn't simply throw up its hands and say, oh, well, they're not using us anymore, so they don't need us anymore. It's what do they need from us now? And so Cossitt becomes they beef up their lending library in the 80s, and in the 90s, it becomes a visitor center for a long time before the visitor center that's down that way now. So trying to reach the tourists who were looking for information, didn't know where to go. So the library provided that. And I spent a fair amount of time at Cossitt because we had a lot of the material, excuse me, that's in the Memphis room, we had to store here because we didn't have enough room at Peabody and McLean. So I would work down here a couple days a week. And so the service was mainly people coming in on their lunch hour, checking out books, checking out videos. You had a terrific staff here. And even though it wasn't a designated visitor center anymore, you still had people coming in because they'd see it, it's open, what's this, and come in. So it never stopped serving the needs of the people. It's just the needs change.
And those needs continue to change in the 90s. I found a really fun picture of the first computers being introduced. And I thought, now that is just so cool to know that that's where we started, right? In the very, 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 very beginning, these two women putting money up for building, and now here people are coming after school. And so tell me a little bit of what the 90s looked like, because it was a fun time.
Yeah, it was, for Cossitt in particular, once the computers came and the internet was available. I must say that the first branch to receive public computers connected to the internet was Levi in 1996. And again, that was a conscious effort to not put it at Maine or Pop White, but to try and reach out to a community. They didn't have access to anything, right? None in their homes, none in their, in some cases, none in their work. And to try and, and be more equitable, right? Because reach out to the smaller branches first, then let more prosperous ones have access. So, but yeah, and so Cossitt had internet installed here probably a year later, probably in '97. So I remember it because I would always leave for lunch and most of the time go to the old tea shop. And but you had to get there at 11 o'clock. So you got there at noon, man, you were, forget it. It actually got to know Sue Hare pretty well. She was such a nice person. But so I would come in the back, but in the morning, but would come in through the middle of the day, and there were always a bunch of people in there. I mean, some people were resting, some people were homeless. They too were as welcome as anybody else, and in fact, it was probably the homeless who probably got more out of the first computers here than anybody else, because they were able, in some cases, to communicate with family members they hadn't talked to, set up an email account, all of these things that would have been, of course, they were pretty new at that point, but but would have had no place to go. But they were able to get that here, and then, of course, by the end of the decade, Robert R. Church School opened, so you have some school kids who can access, still a little far away, but still can have access to here. And I think, they would do library programs, particularly the gallery was very popular. They would have local artists have a gallery space. And if you're a creator like that, and it gave you a free space to exhibit your work, and also an opportunity to do a program, so people would come in who were interested in your work or interested in art in general, to explore that. So all of those things were wonderful programs, and we're always building foundations, right, that lead to the next thing. And what they were doing in the 90s and early 2000s, of course, leads to what we're doing now here in Cossitt, which is phenomenal.
And I think that is a perfect place for us to land so that we can take some Q&A and some other conversation. If anybody has any questions, anybody? Yes, ma'am.
I have two. One is, I'm going all the way back when you started. You said age 5, made this book. Mom, look what I made.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I can visualize that. At what point did you, what age for your first published book?
Much older. I was, let's see, it was 2006, so I was, how old would I have been? 12. That's right. I guess I would have been in my 30s at that point. But before the book, I had spent about 10 years writing for historical journals and encyclopedias. I used to do a bunch of encyclopedia work. It was fun. And it's interesting because, I didn't grow up with a lot of money or connections. So the concept of actually publishing a book sounded, for a guy like me, an impossibility. Or that anybody would care about anything I might have to say. But getting published in small venues like that gave me the confidence to say, well, I'm going to give this a try. But I will say, with the first book, I quit at least a dozen times. I can't do this. But eventually it came together, and I was fortunate that a publisher wanted to publish it, because a lot of authors don't have that experience. And so it just was a building process, but for the longest time, when I was a teenager, I was always writing something, whether it be keeping a journal or trying to write stories or whatever, what have you. In fact, I remember when I was, must have been about 8, I was probably 7, I would write my own newspaper. And actually, I did good in school because I'd be bored with what we were doing in school. And I remember I'd do a headline and I'd do a story. I did a sports column that was written by Jack Eaton, you know. And so, although he was a TV guy, but that's the only sports guy I knew. And I used to do that just for fun. And we made one copy of a neighborhood newspaper that my brother and I and the neighbor across the road did. So it was always stuff like that. But I never felt that I was somebody or my people were important enough to to be able to do something like that. That seemed like far, far beyond. But as I got older, and you get older and you lose a lot of that, if you're fortunate, you lose a lot of that lack of self-confidence if you've got good people around you. So I guess eventually that sank in and I was like, well, I'll give it a try, and it worked. And then I thought I would just do one. But I found first that I kept finding things that I wanted to say. And then I realized that this is a big story. And so like I was saying at the beginning, you know, having, trying to create my own Memphis universe with all of these historical stories and figures and, you know, thinking in terms of, well, when I'm done, then whenever that comes, that I will have written a history, my history of Memphis from all of these different perspectives, from all of these different people's lives and all of these events. That and so that became a driving force and is still with me now.
We're on how many books now?
Well,
Gotta get a 2025.
I guess, well, I think it depends on what you call a book, I suppose, because I've done published books by legitimate publishers. I guess I have my 9th
So
one
we're
coming.
counting all of them.
Well, but the others are like,
Count all of them.
like I did a book about, I've done several books about my family that are just Amazon books. They're for my family. I mean, anybody could buy them if they wanted to. I have no idea why anybody would. But they weren't designed for an audience necessarily. They were designed because I wanted to capture my memories and I wanted to share it with what's left of my family. And then when I was, I kept a journal for a very long time, and I spent 8 summers working at Kaikima Scout Reservation. I was really big in scouting when I was young. And so I kept a journal every summer, and so I typed those up to give to my friends, my fellow staff members. But the cool thing about Amazon is you can create a book. It doesn't cost you anything up front. You don't have to pay for anything. You just pay for copies. So you set the price. So I set it extremely cheap, and where I don't make any money. I would never make any money off it because nobody's going to buy it except for somebody who might know me. So I've done 8 or 9 of those, but I sort of separate those. I know it's all writing and everything, but they're not, no editor ever looked at it. It's all just me, which means it's not going to be as good as it would with somebody else looking at it.
Understood. I just wanted to tell
But I'm not, but I'm
I just
proud
wanted
of
to
it.
tell the people.
Yeah.
That's it. And I'll end with a quote by you. This is one of my favorite quotes that you said. You said, "We in the history department try to capture the whole story of Memphis, not just the lives of the rich and famous. Everyone is a historical figure. Everyone has an impact. Everyone makes a contribution, and everyone has a story. And for that, we say thank you."
Thank you.
We are going to have another continued conversation at 2:30, so you guys get some snacks, hang out with us. We have a fabulous DJ here today. Our interior designer in-house, he hates it when I say that, but he is so fabulous. He also set the set, Mr. Antonio. So you guys hang out with us for a while. Thank you so much much. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank y'all.